It was the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. The air was still cool, the sound of birds carried from the park down the street, and the smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen. I had no reason to expect anything unusual until I heard the harsh, mechanical whine of chainsaws. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighbors had hired someone for some trimming work. But the noise was too close, too loud, almost as if it was right outside my own window. I stepped to the front door and froze. There, standing in my yard like they owned it, were two men in safety vests, orange helmets strapped tight, and bright chainsaws buzzing in their hands. And right behind them, watching with his arms crossed and that smug little smirk, was the HOA president. It didn't take me more than 2 seconds to realize what they were cutting. My tree. My beautiful, decades-old tree that had been there long before I bought the house. It wasn't just any tree, it was the anchor of my front yard, the shade on hot summer afternoons, the place I'd strung fairy lights during holidays, the backdrop for countless family photos. And now, without so much as a knock on the door or a single word to me, they were hacking it apart. I shouted over the sound, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the workers paused, looking a little uncomfortable, but the HOA president stepped forward like he'd been waiting for this confrontation all along. "Violation of neighborhood guidelines," he said flatly. "The tree extends over the allowable height and obstructs the view from the sidewalk." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The so-called allowable height was nowhere in the handbook, and this was the first time anyone had even mentioned it to me. It was clear this wasn't about rules. This was about our argument last month, when I'd refused to remove my vintage fence because he thought it looked out of place. I had pushed back, told him I'd read the regulations cover to cover, and there was nothing in there against my fence. He'd walked away that day with the same smirk he wore now. I tried to stop them, told them this was private property, that I hadn't approved any trimming. He pulled out a clipboard and waved a paper at me, some vague notice I'd supposedly received, authorizing them to handle property appearance concerns. It was a lie. But by the time I argued, the chainsaws were already halfway through their work. Bits of bark and leaves flew into the air like confetti, but this wasn't a celebration. Each chunk of wood that fell felt like a gut punch. When they finally stopped, I walked out to see the damage. My heart sank. They hadn't removed the whole tree, no. That would have been too straightforward. Instead, they'd left it sliced down the middle, flat and awkward, like someone had taken a giant knife and shaved it in half. One side was lush and green, branches reaching outward. The other was a raw, exposed trunk, scarred and ugly. It was the kind of vandalism you couldn't hide with a quick fix. The workers packed up their gear and left without meeting my eyes. The HOA president gave me a final fake sweet "have a nice day" before strolling off down the street, as if he'd just completed some noble civic duty. I stood there in the driveway, staring at what was left of my tree. The sun filtered through the remaining branches, casting uneven shadows on the ground. It was still my tree, but it was wounded, humiliated, and I knew exactly why. This wasn't about height, view obstruction, or rules. This was personal. And as I looked at that half-destroyed tree, one thought took root in my mind. If they thought this was going to make me give in, they were in for a surprise. It was the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. The air was still cool, the sound of birds carried from the park down the street, and the smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen. I had no reason to expect anything unusual until I heard the harsh, mechanical whine of chainsaws. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighbors had hired someone for some trimming work. But the noise was too close, too loud, almost as if it was right outside my own window. I stepped to the front door and froze. There, standing in my yard like they owned it, were two men in safety vests, orange helmets strapped tight, and bright chainsaws buzzing in their hands. And right behind them, watching with his arms crossed and that smug little smirk, was the HOA president. It didn't take me more than 2 seconds to realize what they were cutting. My tree. My beautiful, decades-old tree that had been there long before I bought the house. It wasn't just any tree, it was the anchor of my front yard, the shade on hot summer afternoons, the place I'd strung fairy lights during holidays, the backdrop for countless family photos. And now, without so much as a knock on the door or a single word to me, they were hacking it apart. I shouted over the sound, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the workers paused, looking a little uncomfortable, but the HOA president stepped forward like he'd been waiting for this confrontation all along. "Violation of neighborhood guidelines," he said flatly. "The tree extends over the allowable height and obstructs the view from the sidewalk." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The so-called allowable height was nowhere in the handbook, and this was the first time anyone had even mentioned it to me. It was clear this wasn't about rules. This was about our argument last month, when I'd refused to remove my vintage fence because he thought it looked out of place. I had pushed back, told him I'd read the regulations cover to cover, and there was nothing in there against my fence. He'd walked away that day with the same smirk he wore now. I tried to stop them, told them this was private property, that I hadn't approved any trimming. He pulled out a clipboard and waved a paper at me, some vague notice I'd supposedly received, authorizing them to handle property appearance concerns. It was a lie. But by the time I argued, the chainsaws were already halfway through their work. Bits of bark and leaves flew into the air like confetti, but this wasn't a celebration. Each chunk of wood that fell felt like a gut punch. When they finally stopped, I walked out to see the damage. My heart sank. They hadn't removed the whole tree, no. That would have been too straightforward. Instead, they'd left it sliced down the middle, flat and awkward, like someone had taken a giant knife and shaved it in half. One side was lush and green, branches reaching outward. The other was a raw, exposed trunk, scarred and ugly. It was the kind of vandalism you couldn't hide with a quick fix. The workers packed up their gear and left without meeting my eyes. The HOA president gave me a final fake sweet "have a nice day" before strolling off down the street, as if he'd just completed some noble civic duty. I stood there in the driveway, staring at what was left of my tree. The sun filtered through the remaining branches, casting uneven shadows on the ground. It was still my tree, but it was wounded, humiliated, and I knew exactly why. This wasn't about height, view obstruction, or rules. This was personal. And as I looked at that half-destroyed tree, one thought took root in my mind. If they thought this was going to make me give in, they were in for a surprise. I stood there in the driveway, arms crossed, staring at the mutilated half-tree like it had personally insulted me. The sting of what they'd done still burned, and every time I pictured the HOA president's smug face, my hands tightened into fists. Part of me wanted to march right to his house and let him have it yell until every neighbor heard, maybe even threatened to take legal action. But another part of me, the calmer and more dangerous part, told me that's exactly what he wanted. If I exploded, I'd be the angry homeowner they could write off as unreasonable dots, so instead of letting rage steer me straight into their trap, I took a deep breath and decided to think. That tree wasn't gone. It was wounded, yes, but it was still rooted in my yard, still mine. And if they thought I'd let it stand there as some sad reminder of their petty power, they were wrong. I was going to make it impossible for them to ignore, but in a way they couldn't touch, that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started sketching ideas. At first they were small, maybe hang some lights, plant flowers around the base. But the more I thought, the more ambitious I became. Why stop at decorations? Why not turn it into something worth photographing? Something that would make people stop in their tracks and smile or laugh every time they pass by. I thought about what made the tree unique now, its shape. That flat, exposed trunk wasn't just a scar, it was a perfect canvas. If they'd given me a blank wall in the middle of my yard, why not use it? I could paint murals on it, switch them out every season, even add three-dimensional pieces that made it pop. I could wrap it in lights that shimmered at night, add props for holidays, or create silly scenes that made people pull over just to take a picture. The more ideas I jotted down, the more my anger began to morph into excitement. This was no longer just about getting back at the HOA. It was about taking control of the story. They thought they'd left me with something ugly and embarrassing, but I was going to flip it so hard that people would forget it had ever been. A problem. By the time the clock hit midnight, I had a full plan. It was petty, sure, but it was also creative and completely within the rules. They couldn't fine me for decorating my own tree. They couldn't demand I stop making my property more attractive. In fact, if they tried, it would only make them look worse. The next morning, I headed to the hardware store and loaded my cart with paint, brushes, hooks, garden lights, and anything else I thought I could use. My yard was about to become my personal art gallery, and that half tree was going to be my centerpiece. I wasn't just going to live with it, I was going to make it famous. The next day I was up early with a single mission in mind. The thought they'd left me with a scar in the middle of my yard, but I was about to turn that scar into a statement. I grabbed my keys, got into the car, and drove straight to the biggest hardware and home decor store in town. If I was going to do this, I wasn't going halfway, walking through the aisles. I felt like an artist stocking up for the masterpiece of a lifetime. I started with the lights, rows and rows of them, from soft white string lights to bold, colorful LEDs that could be programmed to change patterns. I imagined them wrapped around the branches, cascading down like a shimmering waterfall, glowing through the night. I filled the cart with several boxes, making sure to get both solar-powered and plug-in versions, so I'd have options. Next was paint. Standing in front of the shelves, I ran my hand over the rows of bright cans, thinking about what would look best against the raw, pale wood of the exposed trunk. I picked a mix of bold colors, deep blues, bright reds, sunshine yellows, and a few earthy greens to blend into the living side of the tree. I grabbed brushes of all sizes, from thick rollers to tiny detail tips, knowing I want to paint both broad designs and fine details. Then came the decorations. I wasn't going for subtle. I wanted people to stop and take notice. I loaded the cart with wind chimes, hanging planters, ribbons, and outdoor-safe ornaments. I found a set of seasonal props, giant plastic flowers, holiday garlands, even a wooden cutout of a smiling sun, and imagined switching them out every few weeks. It was going to be a constantly evolving display, a living art piece that never stayed the same for long. By the time I reached the checkout, the cart was overflowing. The cashier looked at the pile and raised an eyebrow. "Big project?" she asked. I smiled, maybe a little too knowingly. "Oh, you could say that," I replied. "It's going to be the most talked about tree in the county." Back home, I unloaded everything onto the lawn, the supplies forming a colorful mountain at the base of the tree. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at the half-cut trunk. It didn't seem so sad now. It looked ready to be something new, something that would make the HOA grind their teeth every time they drove past. I could almost see it in my mind, the lights glowing at dusk, the colors popping in the daylight, the decorations swaying in the breeze. As the sun started to dip, I plugged in the first string of lights and draped them over the branches, just to see how they'd look. The glow was warm, welcoming, and so completely opposite of the petty act that had left the tree like this. This was going to work. This was going to be better than I'd imagined. And once it was done, there wouldn't be a person in the neighborhood who didn't know exactly which tree was mine. Once the first lights had gone up and the trunk had its first splash of paint, I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time project. If I was going to make this tree unforgettable, it couldn't stay static. It had to keep evolving, like a stage with a new performance every month. That's when the idea struck me. The tree would become a seasonal canvas, always reflecting the time of year, always surprising the people who passed by. Spring came first. I painted giant flowers in bold, joyful colors across the flat side of the trunk. Daisies, tulips, sunflowers, so vivid that people could see them from halfway down the street. Around the base, I planted real flower beds, mixing potted plants with painted wooden cutouts that gave the illusion of endless blossoms. Neighbors would pause during their morning walks just to take in the explosion of color. Kids tugged at their parents' arms, asking if they could come closer to see the magic tree. For the first time since the HOA hacked it down, the tree wasn't a scar. It was alive again. When summer rolled in, I leaned into patriotism. I wrapped the branches with red, white, and blue streamers, draped flags along the trunk, and set up solar lights that glowed in those same colors after sunset. On the flat side, I painted a mural of fireworks bursting across the wood. So, when the actual fireworks lit up the night sky on the 4th of July, it felt like my tree was part of the show. People stopped their cars just to snap photos, and one family even posed in front of it for their holiday card. By the time fall arrived, the tree had already built a reputation. That's when I went all in on Halloween. I wrapped the trunk in orange and purple lights, dangled fake bats and cobwebs from the branches, and painted a giant grinning jack-o'-lantern face on the flat side. On Halloween night, the tree glowed like a beacon, and trick-or-treaters crowded around it, laughing and pointing. Parents told me it was their kid's favorite house on the block, not for the candy, but for the tree. The HOA president drove by that night, his car slowing as he stared at the spectacle, his jaw tight. I pretended not to notice, but inside I was grinning, and then came winter. This was the masterpiece. I turned that half-tree into a half-Christmas tree, stringing it with shimmering tinsel, glass ornaments, and a cascade of twinkling white lights. I even set up a small fake snow machine at the base that puffed out clouds of frosty flakes during the evenings. The mural this time was a snowy landscape with a sleigh painted across the trunk, making the whole tree look like something out of a storybook. Families bundled in coats would come by just to stand in front of it. Some even made it a tradition to take their holiday photos there. Each season, the decorations grew more elaborate, more creative, and more loved. What started as a petty act of revenge had transformed into something bigger, a community attraction. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now stopped to talk, complimenting the newest design. Even strangers driving through town began pulling over, phones out, capturing the ever-changing landmark, and the best part? The HOA couldn't do a thing about it. Every decoration was temporary, every paint layer was harmless, and everything I added fell neatly within the rules they'd written. They could cut my tree in half, but they couldn't cut away the joy and creativity that came after. Season by season, I proved that what they tried to destroy had become something far more powerful, a living, changing work of art that belonged not just to me, but to everyone who stopped to smile at it. At first, it was just one or two people. I'd notice them slowing down when they walked past the tree, phones in hand, framing it just right before snapping a quick picture. Sometimes I'd catch a smile, sometimes a laugh, sometimes even a little shake of the head like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. But it didn't stop there. The next day, there were more teenagers striking poses in front of the painted trunk, families crouching down together to get everyone in frame, kids holding up peace signs while sitting on the curb with the tree. Glowing behind them, it became a regular thing. Mornings, afternoons, evenings, it didn't matter. Someone was always out there, taking selfies. I'd be sitting by my window with a cup of coffee and see a couple walk up, tilt their heads, then start a full-blown mini photo shoot. Some even brought props, flower crowns during spring, little American flags in the summer, Halloween masks in October. The decorations were no longer just mine. People were using them as their own personal backdrop. And then came the real turning point: social media. The first post I stumbled across was a grainy Instagram story, someone tagged as #halftreeart. I smiled and thought nothing of it. But within a week, that same tag had dozens of posts. People started calling it the famous half tree, the art tree, the tree that fought back. Each post got likes, comments, and shares. Some captions praised the creativity, others made sly jokes about the HOA, and a few even speculated on the mystery artist behind it. I never confirmed or denied anything. Let them guess. Part of the fun was watching the story grow without me having to say a word. Soon, locals who didn't even live in the neighborhood began making detours just to see it in person. One Saturday afternoon, I counted 4 different cars pull up within an hour, families stepping out, kids running up to touch the painted trunk, friends taking group shots with the tree glowing behind them. The decorations became like seasonal photo events. In spring, it was couples posing under the painted flowers. In summer, kids waving flags with the fireworks mural behind them. Halloween brought out entire costume squads posing dramatically beside the glowing jack-o'-lantern face in winter. That was the biggest draw of all, families in matching pajamas taking their Christmas card photos with my tree as the centerpiece. It got to the point where I didn't even need to promote it. Social media did all the work. Posts on Instagram, TikTok clips of people dancing in front of the tree, Facebook albums with captions like "Our visit to the famous half tree." The local community page had multiple threads about it, with some neighbors praising it as a beautiful neighborhood tradition, while others, well, mostly HOA loyalists, grumbled about attracting too much attention. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had cut my tree in half to make it less noticeable to maintain uniformity. Instead, they had made it the most famous thing in the entire neighborhood. A living, evolving art piece that people couldn't resist photographing. Every post, every share, every smile in those pictures was another small victory, a quiet reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or destructive. Sometimes it's colorful, joyful, and impossible to ignore. And while the HOA might have hated the attention, the rest of the community loved it. I'd see my tree pop up on feeds I didn't even follow, shared by friends of friends, strangers, from the next town over. The more they tried to control the neighborhood's image, the more my half-tree became its new identity. It started with a knock on my door one crisp Saturday morning. I opened it to find a woman holding a microphone, a cameraman just behind her, and a news van parked at the curb. The reporter smiled and introduced herself from the local station, explaining that they'd been hearing a lot about a certain unusual tree in the neighborhood. Apparently, the story had caught their attention after someone posted a short video on social media showing the half-cut tree decorated with lights and a mural. The clip had gone mildly viral in the area, getting shared on community pages and even a few humor accounts. The station thought it was a perfect feel-good segment for their weekend lineup, a quirky local landmark, a splash of creativity. And though they didn't say it outright, a subtle jab at HOA pettiness, they asked if they could film me decorating the tree. I wasn't about to shy away from the attention, but I also didn't want to turn it into a personal rant about the HOA. So I agreed on one condition: we focus on the art, not the argument. The reporter seemed delighted. Within an hour, the cameras were rolling. They got shots of me stringing lights, painting fresh details onto the mural, and waving to neighbors walking by. They even interviewed a few of them. Most gushed about how the tree had brought the neighborhood together, how it made everyone smile. One older woman said she took her morning walk past it every day just to see what's new. The reporter asked me how it all began, and I told the short version, how the tree was cut in half, how I decided to make it something beautiful instead of sulking about it. I didn't name names or call out the HOA, but I didn't have to. The subtext was obvious. My tone was light, even playful, because that's what made it resonate. People love a story where someone turns a setback into something positive. When the segment aired that evening, I couldn't believe the reaction. My phone started lighting up with texts from friends saying, "Just saw you on TV, and half-tree guy, that's you." The station posted the clip on their Facebook page, and within hours it had hundreds of shares and comments. People tagged friends saying things like, "We have to go see this in person," and "This is the kind of neighbor I wish I had." The funniest part? Even people outside our county started chiming in. Someone suggested making the half-tree a registered landmark. Another joked about starting a half-tree festival every summer. Local businesses even began commenting, offering discounts for anyone who showed them a selfie with the tree, and of course the HOA wasn't thrilled. Word got back to me through the grapevine that they felt the coverage misrepresented the facts. But here's the thing: facts weren't really the point anymore. The tree had gone from being a quirky neighborhood oddity to a symbol of resilience, creativity, and maybe just a little bit of harmless rebellion. That's when I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the community. Every light I strung, every brushstroke I added, every season's new decoration, it all became part of something bigger than my front yard. And with the local news now broadcasting it to thousands, there was no going back. The half-tree wasn't just a landmark in the neighborhood. It was the landmark. When the local news story aired, I knew the HOA board would be fuming. And sure enough, within a couple of days, a stiffly worded letter showed up in my mailbox. It was full of their usual jargon phrases like property uniformity and aesthetic guidelines, but when I read it closely, I realized something important. They didn't actually have any grounds to make me stop. I'd done my homework from the start. When the idea of decorating the half-cut tree first came to me, I dug through the HOS covenants, conditions, and restrictions pages upon pages of rules about everything from mailbox height to the type of mulch you could use. But here's the funny part. Not one single line about decorating trees. They had rules about planting new ones, cutting them down, or removing them entirely, but nothing about painting, hanging lights, or adding seasonal ornaments. In their quest to control every little thing, they'd somehow overlooked this loophole. So, when they sent their letter, all they could really do was strongly discourage my decorations. No fines, no violations, just a grumpy suggestion that I consider the visual harmony of the community. I actually laughed out loud when I read that line, because by this point, visual harmony was exactly what the tree had become. Just not in the way they meant. Still, I wanted to be sure I was completely untouchable. I emailed them back, politely thanking them for their concern and attaching a copy of their own bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. I pointed out again, very politely, that I was in full compliance and would continue to follow the rules. I even threw in a line about how my decorations bring joy to neighbors and visitors alike, which was backed up by dozens of smiling faces in all the selfies. People had been posting. That's when the real shift happened, with no rule to enforce. The HOS hands were tied. They couldn't make me stop without amending the bylaws, and doing that would require a vote from the entire community. By now, I had more than enough neighbors on my side to block any such change. The tree had become something people looked forward to seeing. Kids would ask what the next design would be, and families made it part of their evening walks. Even the local coffee shop had started offering a half-tree latte. As a playful nod to the story, knowing they couldn't touch me gave me a kind of quiet satisfaction. Not the gloating kind, okay, maybe just a little, but mostly the relief of knowing that my little act of defiance was perfectly legal. Every new set of lights I strung up, every mural I painted, every garland I draped over the branches was like a reminder that sometimes the best way to win a fight is simply to outthink your opponent. I also noticed something interesting. The OS tone softened over time. At first, they avoided walking past my house altogether, but slowly some of them began to linger. A couple of board members even made small talk one afternoon while I was repainting the trunk for spring. They didn't compliment it outright, but I caught them taking a longer look than necessary. Maybe, deep down, they knew they'd lost this battle, not because I broke the rules, but because I played their game better than they did. The tree stood there like a bright, defiant monument to the power of reading the fine print. And as long as the rules stayed the same, I was free to keep turning it into whatever masterpiece the season inspired.